I'm Yonit of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcast. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Yonit. How are you doing?
I'm okay. You know, we have a very, very interesting show today, and we're going to talk Ukraine and Israel and Russia and our special guest, Scott Galloway, in this fascinating interview. But before all this is coming up, we have some breaking news from the Unholy desk.
We do. I mean, look, it's slightly dwarfed by world events, but yes, it is quite true that this week I succumbed to the dreaded virus. I got you can hear, can't you? Listen to our sound. And we did jinx it so badly, the pair of us, because after nearly 2 years, we both said, isn't it amazing? Neither of us have got COVID. And then first you and now me with the positive test a few days ago. So, yeah, I am under that. But, yeah, I mean, if ever you wanted a bit of perspective, this really is nothing considering everything that's going on. And 2 years ago, it would have been a big deal. But right now, it's very manageable.
So first of all, being the total gentleman that you are, you let me have it first.
Yes, ladies first.
But,
that's right.
Exactly. But you sound okay. You're sitting at your listeners can hear you, but I see you, and you're sitting at your desk, and you look fine, and you're okay, right? I mean, I don't need my Jewish heart doesn't need to be completely worried and get on a plane and fly to London now, right?
No, you don't need to do that. You don't even need to FedEx chicken soup. We are okay. We're all everyone in the house has got it. It's Plague House here, I'm afraid. So, but we're all managing, and I think you said this when you got it, which is it just makes you incredibly grateful for the vaccines and all the work that was done on that. And it's true. It's because this would have been sort of genuinely, it would have been a very serious business nearly 2 years ago. And as it is right now, it feels like a bad cold, a bit fluey. But you know, nothing more than that. And like I say, and I sort of was half joking, it does give you, proper perspective. There are people who are facing things much, much worse than this right now, as we're going to go on to talk about. So really, it is not holding the front page material, this one. It's trivial.
That's good. That's good. We're happy to hear that on the Tel Aviv end of Unholy, and we hope you feel better. We should talk about what is happening in the rest of the world while you're having this bit of a cold, as you call it.
Yeah, I mean, when we spoke a week ago, I think we probably would have predicted, we would have feared that by now, by the time we're talking, Kiev would have fallen and that I don't know if Russian flags would have been flying, but Russian tanks and troops would have been holding the key in buildings of that city, and that the President Vladimir Zelensky, may have been chased out, may even no longer be with us. And instead, the situation in terms of those bald facts is more or less the same now as it was a week ago, and the Russians are being sort of held off. And that itself is astonishing, and perhaps, was something we'll talk about in a bit more detail. But there are some sort of, and one always hesitates to find, as it were, the local angle. But the areas that particularly interest us have come to the fore this week in quite an interesting way. And by that, I mean the Israeli element, the Jewish element. I'm going to say something in a second about the Jewish thing, but just the Israel's position of really, in a way, neutrality was something you were talking about on this podcast weeks ago and explaining to people. And it's odd because it was quite a niche topic. And then one way or another, it's just gained in prominence and become actually quite important this week.
Yes, so we have been talking about this, as you say. We've been talking about this a lot in previous episodes. It is, I think, quite clear where Israel's sympathies lie. But at the same time, we are walking this very delicate balancing act. And, I think it's fair to say that Israel is acting like there's a bear in its backyard for the very good reason that there is a bear in its backyard. But as time goes by, it's becoming increasingly, people are looking at this, and not only outside Israel, but also inside Israel. So Israel did not join the co-sponsors of the resolution in the Security Council, but it did vote with the U.S. at the General Assembly. You see Bennett not saying the word Russia and Foreign Minister Lapid saying the word Russia. It's very carefully coordinated. So not only is our strategic alliance with the United States the most important thing for Israel, Again, even though Russia is here in Syria, but also the moral question, right? We can't be Israelis asking the world to take a moral stance and not take one when a country is being invaded without a provocation. And we heard that, I brought you the quote of the American official last week saying Israel can't be Switzerland, right? That's pretty clear on what the United States is expecting. Again, the more this will be a prolonged process.
And what's interesting is President Volodymyr Zelensky I was about to say surely, but he just is the most admired leader in the world at the moment and de facto moral leader of the free world. He is making this point deliberately and very pointedly, focusedly, issuing on Wednesday an appeal to Jewish people across the world to speak out about the Russian invasion of his country and calling on Jews and on Israel to do the right thing. And I think this is what I mean about how it's gained in prominence. This isn't only of interest to us. I mean, he thinks it's important enough. And I think this moral dimension is just a very fascinating thing. It's where Jews in some ways are situated in the global imagination.
I will take that a bit further and say that what you're seeing, again, as the world is stepping up, because we have to admit that the world itself, kind of the Western world, fumbled this at the beginning, right? At the beginning, it was more like, if Putin continues this, we're going to, stop his Netflix subscription or not let him into Disney World or something like that. And the world is stepping up. So as the world is stepping up, Israel, whatever its response is, looks in comparison to that, right? So on one hand, we're sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but Israel is being very careful in not sending any weapons to Ukraine, even though the Ukrainian ambassador in this country requested those weapons. So there are all kinds of things. Again, it's not only words, it's what Israel is doing. Israel accepted 6,000 Ukrainian refugees and sent back 50 Ukrainian refugees. The way I say sent back, I mean to Europe, not to Ukraine, which had the Ukrainian ambassador in this country saying something like, we Ukrainians saved Jews during the Holocaust. Now it's your turn to save us. We should pause on that for a minute. I agree completely that we should let any Ukrainian enter this country, but we should just pause on the word save in that context, I think, for a moment. But this is, of course, it's laden with meaning and with historic responsibility and with a lot of things. I think Israel needs to step up a little bit, and I'm saying this as an Israeli.
Yeah, interesting, this idea of responsibility. I mean, and yes, I noticed your pause on the idea of the claim that Ukrainians saved Jews. Obviously, some did, but a lot did not, and there were a large number of Ukrainian collaborators with the Nazis and with the Holocaust. And this is, I think it goes to something interesting. I've mentioned this to a few people, and it seems to have, they've nodded and said it's true, even though they're not necessarily keen to talk about it that publicly. I think Jews, particularly older ones, are a little uneasy about all this because, on the one hand, of course, Ukraine's struggle is now this admired struggle around the world for freedom and liberty. Absolutely, but the Jewish association with Ukraine was not wholly positive. Yes, Jews lived there for centuries and centuries, but it was a place of great brutality, and the Ukrainian people did not entirely distinguish itself in its handling of their Jewish neighbours in the Nazi period. And
that's
what
an
I
understatement.
Yes, I'm being very polite here. What I notice among older Jews, there is a reflex which thinks, hang on, Russia was the side that liberated us. The Red Army liberated Auschwitz. And Ukraine, let's face it, almost all the other occupied nations of Europe were not great when it came to the murder of the Jews in the Holocaust period. And I notice some people have to do something almost consciously unthink that. They have to consciously say to themselves, it's not the 1940s. It's a different period. I saw something very similar, incidentally, in the 1990s, in the Balkans period, where there was a muscle memory that said, oh, hang on, the Serbs, they were the good guys. They were partisans. They were, and then had to unthink that and think, well, now, maybe that was true then, but now Serbs are on the wrong side morally, and ultimately came to a head with Srebrenica. And, it's a similar thing with Germany, where Germany is now the most liberal country in Europe. Again, old Jews with the memories of the Shoah have to unthink the first impulse. So Ukraine, the idea of waving the flag of Ukraine, there's a little bit of vestigial memory that says, Ukraine, Not so sure. That is obviously offset by the fact their leader is a modern-day Maccabee and a total hero. So it's, all of that changes. History is fluid. A previous guest on this podcast, Yuval Noah Harari, has been really interesting about this week, saying there's nothing kind of essential about countries. There was nothing peculiarly German about the Holocaust, etc. Each generation reinvents this stuff for themselves. Now, we have somebody who is so smart to talk about all of this stuff with, a special guest for Unholy, and I'm going to leave it to you, Yonit, to tell our listeners who he is and to introduce him.
Scott Galloway is a professor of marketing at NYU, a serial entrepreneur and author, one of the most interesting, original voices commenting on business, tech, global politics, among other things, host of two of our favorite podcasts, right, Jonathan? Prof G and Pivot with Kara Swisher was already on our podcast, so we just had to bring you on, Scott. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me.
We're having a Florida, Israel, UK meeting. Nice. I have to kind of open up by talking about something that is, I think it is Ukraine, but I think it's actually completely in your comfort zone because it kind of encapsulates business, big tech, and global politics. Because I kind of want to zoom out and see that we have, I think, on the one hand, weakening democracies around the world. On the other hand, like big, powerful tech platforms that are being manipulated by people, by autocratic regimes who spread information, now basically can just invade a country because they want to. I know this is an incredibly open question, but as a representative of a democratic country here, where did we fail?
Wow. We're going to need a bigger boat. I think it starts with, at least in America, with a kind of a lack of trust or lack of respect or investment in our institutions. I think since Reagan in the 80s, Reagan had this saying that the 7 most dangerous words were, hello, I'm from the government and here to help. And we started thinking of our government as the enemy. And it became a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy as we cut taxes and lowered spending or provided our government with less resources. Government became just less adept at what they were doing. Money kind of overran government or politics, and I think people lost faith in their institutions. They don't go to church as much, and they distrust institutions, and then they have these algorithms that will find profit in tearing down institutions or setting us on each other. So our discourse has become more coarse. We no longer trust the government. And I think these institutions represent connective tissue. So when we don't engage in public service or we don't trust our government, it's sort of like, well, what is America then? Is it just a platform for businesses and for fast food? Like, what is it? And also, we haven't had what I call an existential threat, and we may have that with the Russians pouring into Ukraine. But the notion that we see our allies as adversaries now is just sort of strange. So I think it's a lack of connective tissue. In the 50s and 60s and 70s in the U.S., we had great legislation because most of our leaders had served in the same uniform. I would argue that Israel doesn't suffer from the same divisiveness as we do, or at least that's my impression, because I don't know as much about it, because you've all served in the same uniform. I think that's really powerful, and that is, I think Israelis see each other first as Israelis, not as conservative or as liberal. And here in the U.S., a third of each party sees the other party as their enemy, which is just sort of ridiculous when you think about it. And we get so caught up in arguments. Right now, Republicans are very concerned that a trans swimmer represents a threat to us. And it's like, well, there's 190,000 people pouring over a border in Ukraine. Isn't that a bigger threat? And people on the far left see threats. So I think it's a lack of respect for our institutions. And I think there's a profit motive around setting us against each other and finding enemies where we really aren't enemies. We might be competitors, but we're not enemies.
On this point of connective tissue, I'm really struck by that. And I have wondered about it myself about the United States. There was a poll the other day that said there are, among Republicans, more Republicans trust Vladimir Putin than trust Joe Biden. There was also, I just saw a photograph of a couple of Republicans at a Trump rally wearing a T-shirt saying, "I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat." And I'm putting those two things together with what you just said and wondering if it begins to make plausible what had previously seemed a slightly, hyperbolic, hyperventilating scenario, which is that America it's plausible to imagine America coming apart, that actually, even without the old-fashioned Civil War stuff, and we talked about that with David Remnick on this podcast a while back, but whether the lack of connective tissue is so worrying to you that you can imagine a situation where actually America doesn't hold together anymore.
Yeah, it's really, and I have trouble discerning how much of it is I'm getting older and just more pessimistic and depressed, or if these threats are as grave as they really are. But it just dumbfounds me that we would show this type of affection, and everything's become politicized. So vaccines all of a sudden became a left and right thing. If you're conservative, you don't believe in science, you question the efficacy of vaccines. If you're a liberal, you think every conversation around societal issues should immediately be kind of a certain narrative, or they don't feel safe around you. There's no room for actual conversation or discussion or debate. The notion, I think that, unfortunately, for me, a lot of it, I think, well, how do we diagnose the problem before we can put in place some remedies? And for me, in the U.S., it all comes back to one central thing, and that is, for the first time in our nation's history, Jonathan and Yonit, a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. That's the central compact in any society, that your kids will do better than you. And for the first time in American history, that compact has been broken. And then it's especially severe among young men. And that is now for every male graduate from college in the U.S., which is still kind of this on-ramp to a better life in the U.S., there's 2 female graduates. It's 60-40 female to male college attendees, but it's 2-1 because more men drop out and don't matriculate to graduation. You're seeing, relative to any other cohort, and we don't talk about it because no one feels sorry for them, young men are failing dramatically. They're 3 times as likely to overdose. They're 4 times as likely to kill themselves. They're 9 times as likely to end up in prison. They're not graduating from college, as we referenced. And as a result, they're not attractive as mates. We also, on the left, don't like to admit that women have different criteria for mating than men. Women mate socioeconomically horizontally and up. Men mate horizontally and down socioeconomically. And so when men are failing economically, there's an entire population of young men who are shut out from relationships. And the most dangerous person in the world is a young, angry, and alone male. If you look at the most violent, unstable societies in the world, they have too many of this cohort. And we are producing more of them in the U.S. than we've ever produced before. And I think that they are very susceptible to messages of aggression, messages of fake, what I'll call masculinity. And they're angry at the system, and they want to blame people, and they look at an individual like Trump, who is angry and says it's not your fault. I mean, it's a very dangerous narrative that has come out, that has been present in our darkest moments in history, where you have young, directionless males that aren't attaching to work, they're not attaching to school, and they're not attaching to relationships, and they're failing. The percentage of wealth controlled by people under the age of 40 has gone from 19% of GDP in the U.S. to 9%. So they're broke and alone and have no guideposts in the form of relationships, and they're looking for a culprit. And then we have these nationalist people who come along and respect macho and want to restore your sense of masculinity and see aggression, see violence, see invasion, see discrimination against certain groups. They see that as somehow being more politically courageous. And it leads to a very dark place. And unfortunately, because we hate each other so much here in the U.S., that we refuse to even acknowledge that we're all Americans and start developing more camaraderie for each other. So I worry about it a great deal. I do reverse engineer all of it, almost all of it, to income inequality and algorithms that find a profit motive in making us angry at each other. But whenever we in history have gotten to these levels of income inequality, the good news is it always self-corrects. The bad news is it corrects in one of three ways: war, famine, or revolution. And if you look at what's happened in the U.S., we have famine, and pestilence and COVID are a form of famine. We are the wealthiest nation in the world. We have the greatest healthcare system. We control the supply chain of the vaccines. The vaccines were invented here. We have the greatest morbidity per capita of any wealthy nation. So we have famine. And I think we're having a form of revolution. I think the social justice movements in the U.S. have been more violent and more angry because there's this underlying incendiary of income inequality. And I think we're looking we also don't trust our allies, but I see it as very, very unsettling. And I'm not entirely sure. I see the prescription as an investment in younger people, an investment in our institutions, and reinstituting a collective notion of what it means to be American and re-engaging with our allies. But I see it as incredibly troubling. I've never seen anything like this.
That does sound really worrying. I want to actually use your expertise, and I think something also around the area of brand strategy, and to pull you into talking about Israel, if we can. You mentioned that Israelis have a certain camaraderie because most of them, do military service. Now, I'm a person from Tel Aviv sitting in one of the most volatile regions in the world. How is it that this economy here is growing, that the high-tech sector is bringing up so much money? On the other hand, we, of course, have economic disparities. How do you explain all this, what is going on here in this country?
Well, Israel's a huge success story, right? No natural resources and a huge investment in education. There's been tremendous kind of spillover from the military. I'm an investor and on the board of a company called OpenWeb, started by 2 Israeli intelligence officers. And to a certain extent, the fact that you're surrounded by people who want to kill you, you have real enemies, creates a collective camaraderie. And at the end of the day, when missiles start firing over the border, you don't see yourself as part of the Conservative Party. You see yourself as Israeli. Our country has not been attacked. We were attacked on 9/11, but other than some submarines off the Pacific coast in 1942 and 9/11, we have Mexico, harmless Mexico to the south and friendly Canada to the north. There really hasn't been an existential threat that unifies us as Americans. And just as on campuses across America, people are very upset around very real injustices towards special interest groups, whether it's people of color or gay people. And so what I see on campus is they go hunting for fake racists. They go hunting for fake bigots because they're angry and they feel like they want to do something. So they wait until a hapless English professor says something inartful and they go after him. We have diversity and inclusion departments on universities in what are the most diverse and inclusive places in the world. So we've decided to go after each other rather than focusing on some of the very real problems that face us. And in the U.S., I feel as if we've decided to go after each other because the algorithms encourage it, because people are frustrated with income inequality, and we don't appear to have an existential threat that we can rally around. One of the few silver linings in this invasion of Ukraine is I think it's given NATO new purpose and a new sense of gravity. NATO was sort of suffering from what I'd call brain death, and that is they couldn't figure out if they were there to protect against extremists. Should they be pushing back on China? And now it's pretty clear what NATO's for. And it's brought all of us, all these allies have largely kept the peace since 1945 together to speak in a more meaningful way, I think, in a more serious way than, maybe 9/11. I don't even know if that inspired as much cooperation. But my sense is we're finally recognizing we are allies. Israel has education. It has existential threat such that you see each other as brothers and sisters under the same flag. You have your own political divisiveness. But I just don't see the same nonsense coming out of Israel. And also, you've made a massive investment, I think, that's been supported definitely by the government in technology. And you made these huge investments in software that have paid off hugely. So it feels like the perfect storm of good things for Israel. But again, a lot of it is because I have a family on a moshav that seems happy. I'm involved in Israeli tech companies, so I see the best of it. I'm sure you have your own issues as well. But it strikes me that the investment in technology, the investment in education, the strategic positioning around technology, existential threats that unify people under a collective cooperative where they respect each other and have their differences, and then at the end of the day go to sleep as Israelis and wake up as Israelis. We wake up as Republicans or Democrats. I mean, where does that make any sense? So
you just mentioned your family in Israel. You don't come at this totally as an outsider. Just to be a little bit parochial for a minute, just tell us your own connections to some of this stuff, because it's not completely abstract for you.
Well, it's I'm an atheist, but I grew up. My mother's Jewish. I have family that lives in Israel. My cousin was a tank commander. We're all very proud of him. And, one of the greatest alliances, or, it's kind of like Israel and America share this sort of special bond. And it seems to reach across both parties, which is a good thing. But yeah, I just grew up, and a lot of it was just my mom, like, no matter what it is, we support Israel. And, I made that trip that every teenager makes to Israel with friends. So, for me, it's more of a cultural and it's part of my heritage, even though I'm a rabid atheist. I just believe at the end of the day, I'm an American, but I think if shit gets real, the place that's going to land our planes and fight with us would be Israel. And I'm not sure that's true of the other parts of the region. So I have sort of this not very thoughtful, but a kind of a reductionist feeling that is an alliance that is pretty important for us.
And there were a few weeks in Hebrew school as well, right?
There you go. I got kicked out of Hebrew school for trying to resell candy.
That was my gangster move, Scott. I had to remind you of those couple of weeks in Hebrew school. No, I was gonna ask something about education, because you obviously make a lot of that. I think Israelis might argue if there's enough of investment in education, but you talk about this a lot. You started a company that provides access to higher business education, Section 4. I kind of want to ask, as a parent, we're sending our kids to school. Does that mean we're preparing them for the 21st century, or just kind of subjecting them to some kind of unsuccessful babysitting apparatus?
I think it's situational, and I'm not as familiar with the higher education system in Israel. In the U.S., higher ed, I would argue, is sort of morphed from this incredible upward lubricant. The reason I'm here talking to you is through the generosity of taxpayers and something called the University of California, which let me get an amazing education, undergraduate and graduate degrees, for a total tuition of all 7 years of $7,000. And also, even more important than the economic access was just access. When I applied to UCLA in 1982, the acceptance rate was 76%. And I had to apply twice to get in. But I got in. The acceptance rate now is 12%, meaning that the sons of single mothers that aren't remarkable, and there's always a Hallmark Channel or fictional story about the remarkable kid from the inner city who's raised by a single mother and is a genius on math. I can prove to every one of us that 99% of our children are not in the top 1%. It's the top 1% that are going to college, and it's the top 1% that need college the least. The kids who need higher education are the unremarkables. And unfortunately, in the U.S., we've become obsessed with this sort of Hermesification of higher education. And that is, we take our best universities, and there's become a non-economic and economic incentive to reduce admissions rates, such that the head of the admissions department where I work at NYU stands up and says, we rejected 90% of our applicants, and we all stand up and clap as if that's a good thing. And that, for me, is tantamount to the head of a homeless shelter bragging that he or she turned away 9 in 10 people last night. That's not why we're here. We're public servants. We're not fucking Chanel. So in the U.S., we have turned higher ed from this incredibly egalitarian lubricant of upward mobility into the enforcer of this emerging caste system. And there are two cohorts that get into sort of the great elite universities. And elite universities in the U.S. are the best in the world. We're great at making weapons, software, superhero films, and we're great at education, or at least higher education. And the two cohorts that are disproportionately populating Our best universities are first and foremost the children of rich kids. You're 77 times more likely to get into an elite university if you come from a 1% income earning household, top 1%. There's the industrial testing complex, all sorts of resources. And then we gloss over that uncomfortable fact by letting in what I call the freakishly remarkable. And the reality is most of us don't peak at 17. I mean, if you have a patent, our captain of the football team, and also the backup singer in an off-Broadway show and, have built wells in Africa by the time you're 17, more power to you. But the majority of kids aren't like that. And in the U.S., it's become a bit of the Hunger Games, where if you win, you lead a remarkable life, but everybody else kind of dies sort of a slow, hideous death. And I would argue higher ed is about the unremarkables. The children of rich people end up with by the time they're out of high school, they have pretty good educations. They have contacts, they have skills. They need college the least. And those are the ones that are getting into the elite universities. So I don't know if the same thing is true in Israel, but here we have transferred $1.5 trillion in wealth from middle-class households to universities because there's sort of this trope in America where if you don't send your kids to college, you failed as a parent. And because the elite universities are so selective now and take so much pride in that, good kids that aren't amazing or don't have rich parents get arbitraged down to mediocre schools. And what you have in America is the majority of kids end up paying a Mercedes price for a Hyundai product. And they come out of school with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt for what is a mediocre degree. Whereas where it used to be in the 80s, you get a great degree from a place like UCLA for a small amount of money. So I think we need to go back to the future and kind of fall back in love with what I refer to as the unremarkables.
It's so interesting hearing the idea of going backward, because even radical people now find themselves often having to do that, of invoking the past rather than some new progressive idealized future. But I want to go, there may be a common link here, but I want to go back to the thing you've mentioned 2 or 3 times in our conversation as a culprit, namely algorithms. And what is the way to rein those in? And you think about the big strains of political thought over the last several centuries, they've been about sort of taming overmighty tyrants, kings, monarchs. That's how your country was founded. People sort of got their heads around how you do that. You drew up a brilliant document, the American Constitution, showing us how to do that. Now the human race is confronted by something very different, and you've put your finger on it in your work, talking about algorithms. Do we need to come up with a fix on a similarly grand scale? In other words, something that stands alongside the American Constitution and, Magna Carta, to rein in and tame the algorithms that seem to control so much of our lives?
Yeah, so 2010, we spent 3% of our life on phones. Now we spend 34% of our waking hours on phones. And the content we see is served up by algorithms. And these algorithms have a profit motive. The algorithms in and among themselves aren't inherently benign or evil. They're programmed by people who program them for profit maximization. And we're a tribal species, and we're drawn to violence and disagreement. And so the algorithms recognize this, and they think if we can encourage people to start arguing, if we promote content that's incendiary, so I want to start off by saying the dissenter's voice is really important. It's really important that we have a conversation around, whether or not vaccines alter your DNA. But when you say that, the algorithm goes, oh, this really upsets people. And it causes a lot of heated conversation. So let's promote those statements around white supremacy or hate speech or anti-vax, because that content inspires more enragement. And the enragement equals engagement, which equals more Nissan ads. And so what you find is some of this content, which is kind of dangerous and just blatantly false, gets more oxygen than it would on its own. And I think that's the first mistake, is people assume that any discussion around whether these algorithms are bad is basically a decision around censorship. It's not censorship. If I go on my podcast and I say that your 15-year-old is running the risk of an enlarged heart if you give him a vaccine, I have an onus as a responsible person with a decent reach to fact check that and find that there's only been 7 cases of that reported in all of Florida across the hundreds of thousands of young men who have received a vaccine. But that content inspires a very, very visceral reaction, and the algorithms love that, so they start elevating the content and giving it more oxygen and sunlight than it would get on its own. So one, I think we need to remove some of the legal protections that these organizations have from some of the damage they do. And that is, if we could reverse engineer this podcast to teen depression and eating disorders, this podcast would be legally liable, and we would probably start being more thoughtful around the type of content we put out. Right now, Facebook suggests extreme dieting sites to a 15-year-old girl who's 5'10", 100 pounds. Two-thirds of extremist sites on YouTube that young men engage in are suggested to them by algorithms. And they have no real profit incentive to rein in that content. As a matter of fact, they have a profit incentive to keep it going because of Section 230. So one, I think it's regulation. I do think there's a capitalist solution, and that is just competition. Because if Google and Facebook had 6 or 8 competitors, P&G doesn't like what's going on with teen depression. They see the problems, but they don't have any choice. I'll spend $2 or $3 million this year on Facebook. It makes me sick to my stomach. But if you want to build an online education company, you kind of have a choice. The choice is, do you spend money on Google or do you spend money on Facebook? It's just, if you want to acquire consumers online, you have to spend money online. And there's 3 companies that get 90 cents on the digital dollar between Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So I think it's regulation. I think it's competition, increased competition. I would break these companies up. We have a proud legacy of antitrust in the U.S. where we go in and break companies up. And also, I don't think any of this really moves the needle until someone gets sent to prison. I don't, in the U.S., I don't know if you heard of the Varsity Blues scandal. We were talking about higher ed. But basically, there was this system where this consultant was saying to wealthy parents, give me $500,000. I'll give it to the Stanford sailing coach. He will submit their application and say that they're a sailor, and they will get in as a student athlete. And the thing is, that happens every day, and these people did it, and some of them went to jail. Aunt Becky, or Lori Loughlin from a TV series here, went to jail. Mm-hmm. And if somebody calls anyone now and says, I can get your kid in for $500,000 under posing as an athlete, they're hanging up the phone because they saw Aunt Becky from Full House do a perp walk. Right now, what's effectively happened with big tech is they have this parking meter in front of their house that costs $100 an hour. To implement these moderation tools are expensive, but the parking ticket costs 25 cents. So their motivation is to break the law and to continue to break the law because there's no real algebra of deterrence. Any fine we come up with is a fraction of their cash flow. So everyone was just blown away by the $5 billion fine we levied on Facebook for violating our privacy and Cambridge Analytica. That's 11 weeks of profit, and it took us 3 years to get that through. So competition, regulation, and also I do think some of this delay and obfuscation around covering up information as it relates to teen depression should have criminal action filed against them.
I have to ask you before we let you go about the podcast medium, which you have been incredibly successful in, and we also interviewed your co-host Kara Swisher, and we asked her what her secret for a pod distance relationship was with you, and she said patience. Patience. So I wonder what you would say after hearing that she said patience.
Well, I'm a big fan. So Yonit, I worked my ass off for 30 years so I could be an overnight success, courtesy of Kara Swisher. So I love working with Kara. The nice thing about, and we were going back to polarization, I'm a crude and profane person. I make all sorts of inappropriate jokes. And I think the reason that, and one of the things I believe about progress around embracing each other, people of color, people of different sexual orientations, people from different backgrounds, is I think teasing is affection. I think we'll know when we've made progress when we can make light of our differences. And one of the things that I really enjoy with Kara is she makes fun of, kind of what a jarhead fraternity boy I am. And I make fun of her around how woke she is. And we talk about each other's sexual orientation very openly, and we rib each other. And I think that's progress. And also when I say something inappropriate or profane, there's a there's a quietness and a silence. And then when she laughs, it kind of gives everyone else permission to laugh. Because I think all of us deep down find some of this stuff kind of funny. So what I really like about Kara is that she gives me cloud cover to be a little bit inappropriate. And people recognize that on the important stuff, there's a lot of people out there who are empathetic, good people, want the best for people, but still see humor, still can be crude or profane. It can be vulgar, and that's okay. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. So I absolutely love the partnership. It feels like you guys have a good rapport and a good partnership. The other thing that's really interesting about the medium is the medium really is the message. If someone comes up to me and gives me they recognize me, I know they've seen me on TV. If somebody writes me a really long, thoughtful email, it means they've read one of my posts. The written word is really powerful when it resonates with people. If someone comes up to me and just starts talking to me as if they know me, it means they listen to the pod. Because there's something about being in someone's ears and them getting used to their voice. They begin to believe that you're speaking to them and that you have an informal relationship. And I don't know if this happens to the two of you, but there's something very intimate and familial about the podcast medium. And that's very rewarding because people come up and it's like your friendship starts at letter D. They just start talking to you as if they know you and you know them. And then they have to say, oh, wait, it's been one way. Yeah, I know you, but you don't know me. But I find the medium fascinating. I'm much more handsome on podcast. I have a very good-looking voice. But at TV, it starts to all fall apart. But I've loved it, and I've loved working with Kara.
I think, Yonit, you're going to give me cloud cover for my profanity from...
There you go.
Oh, completely. You're so vulgar.
There you go.
You're so
vulgar, so crude.
Yeah, I chose an Englishman. I'm not sure vulgar is exactly the operative word.
I was just, when you said that, Scott, I was just thinking of how I was inappropriately over-friendly to someone whose podcast I listen to all the time. And I realized I am that guy who comes up to you in the airport. I listen to a football, soccer podcast, and I'm way too friendly to the host of it when I've met him a couple of times for exactly the reason you said, which is that in your ear you feel they're your friend. So you've nailed it.
It's so rewarding, though. People, I was out with my kids. We went to Chick-fil-A, and someone came up to me and started talking to me. It was such a nice moment for me. My kids still don't know what I do. And and people come up to you all the time and start talking to you. And people say, how does it feel? And I'm like, it feels wonderful. It's really validating, and people are friendly, people are nice. So I'm sure it happens to the two of you too, but it feels great. And what they say, which I find hard to believe, is that for every person that comes up to you and says hello, there's 100 people who recognize you. And it's just funny to think that you walk into a mall and there's 100 people that you sort of have a relationship with. It's a nice feeling. And it also creates a level of responsibility as my audience has grown, and I don't know if you guys feel this way. I feel more of an onus to fact check my data and be a little bit more thoughtful. Like yesterday when we did the podcast, I said, let's not talk about Ukraine. I just don't feel as if I understand it well enough to be thoughtful about it. And people listen to us. But I find the kind of the new friends you acquire on this medium, I think it's wonderful.
Scott Galloway, thank you so much for being with us on Unholy.
Thank you.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thanks for your good work.
So that was truly fascinating, I think. There are so many things to say about that conversation. Jonathan,
starting with his voice, by the way. He's not wrong about that great voice. Good-looking voice. My word. Amazing voice.
Are you a little bit jealous? Is this Jonathan Friedland being a little bit jealous?
Not with my COVID voice. I'm quite proud of my COVID voice. I could do voiceovers with this. Yeah, no, I'm not having problems.
Paging
on that score
Disney,
today.
paging Disney animators, right? They like to make the.
I could be the English villain.
Exactly, they like to do that, don't they? Kill parents off at the beginning of the film and have English villains. That's what they do very well. What I was thinking when he was talking about like Israeli education and the way in which our society is. He's right about the fact that there's, I think, still more keeping us together in Israel than is tearing us apart. But I mean, in Israel, it's so clear that the question that usually is so prominent in the United States, where did you go to school, doesn't really exist. What happens in this country is usually, where did you do your military service? And if it's a combat unit and increasingly military intelligence, you have the golden ticket into politics and into business. That, of course, is a problem when it comes to women and when it comes to minorities. Even there are more and more minorities, more and more women in combat units. But still, it does exclude certain groups. And of course, I have to comment on his advice on what was that pod distance relationship?
Yeah, I like that. What was the secret ingredient?
I think they both, at the end of the day, both Kara and Scott say the same thing, which was being patient to Scott's vulgarities, which is true. But I think
I don't feel we have that problem. Do you? Do you feel we have that problem?
I don't think so. But I think what he said, which was really interesting, is the fact that you kind of need to laugh, right? And you need to realize that things come out of affection. They're not everything you say is offensive. When I mean you, I don't mean you, of course, because we don't say anything offensive. But I like that. But those was my takeaways. What would you say?
I think it was true about sort of patience. But that implied that they kind of try each other's patience. Well, I'm not sure we're quite like that with each other.
Oh, give us time.
But
give
it's
us
true.
Time,
Give
Jonathan.
it time. And I thought he was really interesting on, toxic masculinity, and it definitely is a big part of this. And I mean, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago about all those populist leaders, Bolsonaro and Trump and Duterte, and actually it really is Putin. The common link is a very particular, kind of very warped machismo in all their cases. I just think he's really perceptive on all those things, and it was a really, fascinating, wide-ranging conversation. He's one of those people who's very smart and can range across the whole kind of savannah. And it was great to have him on. We have some awards to hand out. I think you are making a little habit, one might even say, of making a claim for the mensch honours. So who is in your sights?
Would you say that I'm using my Israeli chutzpah to hog the mensch awards? Is that what you're trying to say?
Hog again is a verb that sits uneasily with me because of the ancient dietary laws of our people. But yes, why not?
Okay, so I want to respond in our mensch awards this week. I would want to respond to a good friend of our pod, Raymond Simonson, who is also, I believe, the director of the JW3 in London. And I'm not saying that title is more important than the title friend of the pod, but he is also a friend of the pod. And he suggested on Twitter this week that we both create a special mensch of the decade award and give it to Zelensky. Now, I sadly, as the head of the Tel Aviv branch of the Unholy franchise, I don't have that authority and jurisdiction to give a mensch award of the decade.
Yeah, no, I said to Raymond we would have to summon the whole committee, which I think meets either in Oslo or Stockholm, and it would require an extraordinary general meeting.
It's a secret place. We don't disclose it. Yes. But a decade is a long time, Raymond. Things can happen in a decade. Just think of the 2 decades it took from Rudy Giuliani to shift from hero of 9/11 to Four Seasons Total Landscaping, right? So a decade is a long time. We don't want to give that extended, a title, but we will, on the first time in the history of this program, give him the Mensch Award second week running to Zelensky. Who else? I mean, let's be honest. This badass Jew, right, who is for his bravery and his courage, and I think it's well deserved. What do you think?
I think Raymond makes a very strong point, and we could just be giving it to him week after week after week. And in a way, please God that we do that, because we want him to carry on thriving and doing this amazing stuff. He is obviously a sort of modern day hero. The video came out of him not only competing in the Ukrainian edition of Dancing with the Stars, or Strictly Come Dancing, which showed he was a very good mover, but also it emerged that he voiced Paddington Bear in the Ukrainian version of the movie. And somebody tweeted, could he do anything more to make Middle Britain fall in love with him than being Paddington and dancing on Strictly or Dancing with the Stars? So he is obviously a hero. In a normal week, I would want to make an honourable mention of Israel's Supreme Court, which made a decision on the Sheikh Jarrah case about the Palestinian families there who had been slated for eviction from their homes from that East Jerusalem neighborhood. And the court held that they basically can stay until a final decision has been made. It's only a sort of interim kind of holding ruling, but it did mean the court had partially accepted the Palestinian residents' appeal, and it means for now they can keep living where they are. The reason why I think that's important, I mean, one of their lawyers said it's an incredible legal victory. All you have to do is imagine the consequences if it had gone the other way. And with everything else going on, the idea of that kind of injustice and then the response that would have been on the ground, who knows, with riots and maybe much, much worse. We know from previous and fairly recent experience what a powder keg Jerusalem is. So well done to the Supreme Court for that decision, partial, incomplete, or whatever as it may be. In terms of chutzpah, I thought, and I say this not only as an Arsenal fan, although I am an Arsenal fan, as you know, but Roman Abramovich, the owner of Chelsea, has put up his football club, saying, doing it with a very heavy heart and done it with great speed. And he's doing it because he fears that he's going to be, and Chelsea will be, the target of sanctions. The leader of the opposition in Britain, Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, made his first question at Prime Minister's Questions this week. When are you going to sanction Roman Abramovich? He is a close associate of the Russian leader. He is a huge oligarch with a massive fortune and one of the most visible oligarchs in London. We're owning one of London's big football clubs, clearly not the most important or storied football club in London, but the owner of it.
A very objective view of the story, yes.
Big houses, big residences. And look, it's chutzpah of him to sort of think, right, let me offload it so I can trouser the money. He wants £3 billion for it. But also, in a way, chutzpah of the British government. And it's done this with a lot of them. It's given a lot of the oligarchs a lot of notice, effectively saying, quick, sell your stuff before we put sanctions on you, rather than imposing it immediately. So chutzpah awards are plenty in the direction of the oligarchs, I think.
For sure. We're very close to winding down our program this week, Jonathan.
We should, but first, because I know we often do thank yous at this point, I have to do a thank you from me to you. Because listeners last week heard our exchange about the etiquette of opening birthday presents. The upshot was I believed you don't open a birthday present till it's your actual birthday. So I didn't open the lovely parcel that came from one Yonit Levy to me until Friday, the day of my birthday. And there, I'm just looking at it right now, within all the wrapping, and it had been meticulously wrapped, I should mention that, was a framed edition of the front page of the Haaretz newspaper for February the 24th, 1967. Now, it turns out, and this is a sort of amazing thing here, but, well, maybe you should tell the story of that. But anyway, it's a beautiful thing, and it's amazing because the lead story of the paper is about the then Soviet Union engaged in a border dispute. And we have Sovietim, and we have Tzvon Vietnam, and all of that. It is a fantastic document, but mainly it's a beautiful gift, and it's going to go straight on the wall of this room, and it was your birthday gift to me.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. That is what that headline reads, basically. Yes, the idea was actually to get you a first page of Haaretz newspaper from the day you were born, and then I discovered that the day you were born was a Saturday. Very really not considerate on your part. So I got you the day before and the day after, which you could choose whatever you want to put on, of course. And just saying, I mean, I love that you love the gift. I'm just saying that this year the universe gave you for your birthday COVID. So anything that I would have sent would probably be, I mean, if I sent scrap metal and wrote thinking of you, that would be better than what the universe got you this year. But I'm very glad that you like it, and no pressure and no competition. By that I mean a lot of pressure and a lot of competition.
I have no idea.
You have 5 months.
I have no idea how I'm going to match that. And don't think I haven't thought about it, because I have. No, and incredibly, until then, I actually did not know that I was born on a Saturday, because the family story I'd always been told was that it was Erev Shabbat, it was Friday night, when my mother went into labour. The candles were lit, and she was rushed to the hospital and into labour. And therefore, I'd always assumed I was born on a Friday night. But no, it was obviously the early hours of a Saturday morning. Saturday, no Hebrew papers are published, no Israeli papers are published. Therefore, we have the other one there. And look at it, I love it already. It's framed under glass. It's done so. In on both sides, it's very, very cleverly done and beautiful, and means I cannot even hope to match it come July. But don't worry,
a bronze statue of me in the entrance of the Friedland clan household.
That could be one, or Chelsea Football Club is the other one. I just need $2 or $3 billion. We can start crowdfunding on the podcast for that. But we should say, if you have enjoyed this, please do rate or review or give us lots of stars. And we have some thank yous that are not me to you.
Indeed. And I will also remind our listeners of our email box, which is getting more mail for Jonathan than for me, I'm just saying. And that is unholy@keshet, KESHET-TV.com. And thank yous to Rom Atik, Lior Friedman, Irad Eshel, and of course Omer Primat. And Jonathan, feel better. We will meet you COVID-free, I hope, next week.
I hope so too. See you then, Yonit.